The slap came without warning. 1 second, Elena Vasquez was standing beside the glass conference table, tablet pressed to her chest, waiting for Julian Vane to finish signing the last document in the stack. The next second, his open palm connected with the side of her face so hard that her earring flew across the polished floor and skidded under the radiator. The sound it made, that sharp, flat crack, cut through every conversation in the room like a gunshot. 3 senior executives froze mid-sentence. A junior analyst knocked over his water glass, and for exactly 4 seconds, nobody in that boardroom breathed. Then Julian Vane straightened his cufflink, picked up his pen, and signed the document as if nothing had happened. "Next time," he said, his voice perfectly level, "you will have the Hartwell revisions on my desk before I walk into a meeting, not during it. Are we clear?" Elena didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She stood perfectly still with her hand pressed to her cheek, her dark eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond Julian's shoulder, and she said nothing. The room remained frozen. His CFO, a gray-haired man named Preston, was staring at the table with his jaw set so tight his teeth had to be grinding. The legal counsel, a woman named Andrea, had gone completely white. Nobody spoke, nobody intervened, because this was Julian Vane's building, Julian Vane's company, and in this room, Julian Vane was the law. He clicked his pen closed and looked up at her, mildly irritated that she hadn't responded. "I said, are we clear?" "Yes," Elena said, one word, flat, empty of everything except the decision she had just made in the silence behind it. "Good. Get out." She walked to the door. She didn't run. She didn't look at any of the executives who were now staring at their phones or their folders or anything that wasn't her. She opened the glass door, stepped into the corridor, and she kept walking, past her desk, past the reception area, past the elevator banks, all the way to the emergency stairwell at the far end of the floor. She pushed through the heavy door, let it close behind her, and stood in the sudden echo of concrete and steel. Only then did she let herself exhale, a long, controlled breath that she pushed out through her nose while staring at the gray cinder block wall. She did not press her hands over her eyes. She did not cry. She pulled out her phone and she called her brother. It rang twice. "Elena." His voice was the same as it always was, low, even, the voice of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by anything the world chose to throw at him. "Elena," she said. And that was it. That was all she said, because the way she said his name, that single syllable with that specific weight behind it, told him everything. There was a pause of perhaps 3 seconds. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "My face," she said. "He slapped me in front of the whole board." Another pause, shorter this time. "Go home, right now. Don't stop anywhere, don't talk to anyone, just go home and lock the door." "Elena." "Marco." And there was something in his tone now that she recognized from childhood, something that was not anger exactly, something much colder than anger and far more dangerous. "Go home." She hung up. She went home. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, was that her brother had already been watching for 47 minutes before she called him. 3 weeks earlier, Marco Vasquez had received a call from a man who worked in building security at the Vane Tower. This man, a compact, quiet former soldier named Dmitri, who owed Marco a debt that predated Elena's employment by 5 years, had called to report something simple and specific. Julian Vane had begun screaming at Elena in his office at least twice a week. Not arguing, not raising his voice, screaming, the kind of sustained, methodical verbal destruction that is designed not to correct behavior, but to break a person's sense of self down to rubble so that they become easier to manage. Dmitri had watched it on the security monitors. He had watched Elena absorb it without flinching, and he had watched Julian Vane perform it with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it a long time. Dmitri had called Marco because he thought Marco should know, not because he expected Marco to do anything about it immediately. He knew how Marco worked, and Marco never moved immediately. He called because withholding that information from Marco Vasquez felt, in some instinctive animal way, like the kind of error that could ruin a man's life. So Marco had known, and Marco, in his characteristically methodical fashion, had done something about it that was so quiet and so complete that not a single person in Vane Tower was aware it had been done. He had accessed the building's security infrastructure through a digital back channel that cost him a conversation with a very expensive man in Singapore, and he had gained live, uninterrupted access to every camera on floors 32 through 37, which was where Elena worked, which was where Julian Vane's executive suite was located, and which was where, on a gray Tuesday afternoon in mid-October, a boardroom full of people watched a billionaire CEO open-hand strike a woman who weighed perhaps 50 kilograms and had done nothing except fail to deliver a document fast enough. Marco had been watching the camera feed on his secondary monitor when it happened. He was in the middle of a meeting with two of his senior associates, a man named Carver and a woman named Rossi, both of whom were discussing a shipping arrangement that required his attention. He had been half listening to them while monitoring the feed out of habit. He had seen Julian enter the boardroom. He had seen Elena follow with the tablet. He had watched the interaction for perhaps 90 seconds before Julian's hand moved, and after that he watched the feed for another 3 minutes in complete silence while Carver and Rossi gradually became aware that something had changed in the room and stopped talking. "Get out," Marco said, without looking away from the monitor. They got out immediately, closing the door behind them without a word. Marco sat alone and watched Elena walk out of the boardroom. He watched her pass her desk. He watched her disappear into the stairwell. He waited until she appeared on the parking level monitor, confirming she was heading for the exit, and then he picked up his phone. Not to call Elena, he called a man named Sal. "Sal," he said when the call connected, "I need the full package on Julian Vane. Everything Greco's team pulled last year, plus whatever's current. I want it in the next 2 hours." "Already on it," Sal said, which was either extraordinary coincidence or confirmation that word traveled even in the spaces where Marco operated. Either way, it didn't matter. "And get me Dmitri." He hung up, picked up a second phone, and made 3 more calls in rapid succession. Each one lasted under a minute. Each one ended with the same instruction, delivered in the same unhurried tone: "Stand by." By the time Elena called him from the stairwell, Marco had already set 6 things in motion. The call from her was the 7th. Julian Vane returned to his office after the board meeting in excellent spirits. This was the thing about Julian that those who didn't know him well consistently failed to understand. He wasn't cruel out of frustration. He wasn't volatile, unpredictable, or emotionally dysregulated in any way that inconvenienced him. He was cruel because cruelty worked. Because in 22 years of building his conglomerate from a mid-sized logistics company into a $14 billion empire, he had learned that the most reliable way to maintain dominance over the people around you was to remind them, regularly and viscerally, that you could hurt them and face no consequence for it. This was not a philosophy he had arrived at through cynicism. It was a conclusion he had drawn from direct observation, tested repeatedly, and found consistently reliable. He poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon from the crystal decanter on the credenza and stood at his floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city spread below him like a map of everything he owned. He was 51 years old, lean in the way of men who paid serious money for their fitness, with silver at his temples and a face that photographers described as commanding. He had a penthouse on the 54th floor of this building, a country estate 2 hours outside the city, a yacht that he used perhaps 3 times a year, and a network of legal, political, and financial relationships that functioned in practical terms as a second immune system, designed specifically to protect him from consequences. He thought about Elena Vasquez briefly and decided she would either fall back in line or she wouldn't. If she submitted a formal complaint, his legal team would handle it the way they handled everything, quietly, efficiently, and with enough financial settlement to ensure the problem disappeared without public noise. If she quit, he would have her replaced within a week. Either way, the problem resolved itself. What Julian did not think about, because he had no reason to, was whether Elena Vasquez had anyone in her life who operated in spaces his legal team could not reach. His entire defensive architecture was built on the assumption that the world worked the way he understood it to work, through institutions, through money, through influence over systems that other powerful people also used, and therefore also respected. It was an architecture built for protection from people like him. It offered essentially no protection from people like his brother. His phone rang. It was his CFO, Preston. "The Hartwell deal is through," Preston said. "Wire cleared an hour ago." "Good," Julian said. "Also," Preston said, and his voice shifted almost imperceptibly in a way that Julian, who was good at reading people, caught immediately. "About what happened in the boardroom." "What about it?" A pause. "Legal is going to want to flag it, standard protocol." "Let them flag it. Let me know when the Hartwell funds are confirmed allocated." "Julian," Preston said. "Julian." He said it the same way he said everything, with the complete absence of any question about whether he would be obeyed. "I'll talk to you in the morning." He ended the call, finished his bourbon, and had his driver take him to dinner. At 11:47 that same evening, a man named Theo sat in a server room in a building across town and finished the last of what Sal had asked him to prepare. He sent the file to Marco's encrypted account, then leaned back in his chair and cracked his knuckles. The file contained everything. Julian Vane's legitimate financial architecture was the first layer, $14 billion in declared assets, the corporate structure of Vane Global with its 47 subsidiary companies, the shareholder arrangements, the board composition, the debt profile, standard material, publicly available to anyone who knew where to look. The second layer was more interesting. It contained the shadow architecture, 4 offshore holding companies registered in jurisdictions that didn't talk to each other, 12 accounts spread across 3 continents that received irregular deposits from what appeared to be consulting fees paid by entities that, when you trace them back far enough, turned out to be owned by the same 4 offshore holding companies. A loop. Money moving in circles, generating the appearance of legitimate business activity while actually functioning as a very large, very carefully designed laundering mechanism for the proceeds of a series of insider trading positions Julian had been running since 2019 through a nominee trader in Geneva. The third layer was the most interesting of all, and it was the layer that made Theo sit forward in his chair as he compiled it, because it was the kind of material that didn't just end careers, it ended freedom. There was an arrangement Julian maintained with 2 separate city councilmen, documented in a series of encrypted messages that Julian had evidently believed were deleted and were not. There was a property deal in which Julian's company had purchased a block of residential buildings, displaced 312 tenants through a coordinated campaign of code violation reports and maintenance neglect, and then sold the land to a development consortium in which Julian held a silent interest through one of his offshore vehicles. And there was one more thing. A legal settlement from 8 years ago involving a former employee that had been sealed under an NDA so comprehensive it had its own enforcement mechanism, but which Theo had found anyway through a chain of document cross-references that only someone very good at this kind of work would have thought to follow. Theo sent the file and closed his laptop. By midnight, Marco had read all of it. He was sitting alone in the room where he did his serious thinking, a study in the back of the house, lined with books he had actually read, lit by a single lamp on the desk. He read the file twice, cover to cover, and when he was done, he set the tablet down and sat for a long time looking at the wall. He wasn't angry, this was important. The anger had come and gone in the 30 seconds after he watched Elena's head snap sideways from the impact. What remained now was not anger, but something cleaner and more functional, the cold, methodical focus of a man who had spent 2 decades building an organization specifically designed to move against problems like this one, and who was now faced with the problem he had always, in some quiet part of himself, known was coming. He picked up his phone and called Rossi. "The financial strike goes tomorrow. Full sequence. I want it to move like one event, not like pieces. By the time anyone figures out what's happening, the first 3 layers should already be done." "Understood," Sagi Rossi said. "Timeline?" 6 a.m. start. I want the offshore accounts flagged with the relevant regulatory bodies before the New York market opens. The Geneva nominee should receive a visit from a compliance officer he doesn't know is working for us by 9. The councilmen get the package at 10. The sealed settlement goes to 2 journalists at noon. Use the contact in Berlin for the European feed. Use our person at the wire service for domestic. And the corporate structure? Not yet, Marco said. That comes after he knows. I want him to watch the rest of it happen first. You want him afraid. I want him to understand what he started. Good night, Rossi. He ended the call and went to bed. He slept without difficulty, the way he always did, because in Marco Vasquez's internal world, a decision made was a weight lifted. The doing was simple from here. It was the deciding that required energy, and that was done. If you've been following this story and you want to see more content like this, stories where power meets its match and the wrong people discover the real cost of arrogance, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop a comment below telling us, what do you think Julian Vane is going to do when his world starts falling apart? Because it is about to fall apart in ways he cannot imagine. Elena woke the next morning to a message from her direct manager, a man named Howard, who had always been professionally kind to her in the way of people who are aware of what's happening around them and have decided that their continued employment requires them to be blind to it, telling her that her services were no longer required, that a severance package commensurate with her tenure had been prepared, and that she could collect her personal belongings from the building's front desk where they would be boxed and waiting for her. She read the message twice, set her phone down on the kitchen counter, made herself a coffee, and thought about what to feel. She had expected this. Not immediately. She had expected perhaps a week of careful institutional distance while legal prepared the paperwork. But the speed of it only confirmed what she had always known about Julian Vane, which was that he moved to eliminate problems the same way he moved against market competitors: fast, complete, and without any interest in the collateral. What she felt, sitting at her kitchen counter with her coffee, was something surprisingly close to relief. She had been working for Julian Vane for 3 years. She had been exceptional at her job for all 3 of them, and she had spent approximately 18 months of those 3 years being systematically diminished by a man who viewed excellence in subordinates as a threat to be managed rather than a resource to be developed. The blow in the boardroom had been the physical articulation of something he had been doing to her in subtler ways for a long time. Walking out of that building had felt, even through the shock and the sting of the slap, like drawing a full breath after a long time underwater. She called Marco. "They fired me," she said. "I know," he said. She paused. "How?" "Because it's what he does. It's what people like him always do." A brief silence. "How are you?" "I'm okay," she said, and she was surprised to find that she meant it. "Good," Marco said. "Elena, I need you to stay away from all of this. Don't go to the building, don't call anyone from work, don't speak to journalists if they call you." "Marco, what are you doing?" "Taking care of it," he said. "I don't need you to—" "Elena." And again, that tone. Not commanding exactly. Marco had never commanded her in their lives, not once, not even when they were children and he was the older one, and it would have been easy for him to fall into that role. It was something different. It was the tone of a man who was telling her something true. "You're my sister. You've been my sister since the day you were born, and nothing that has happened to you in your life has ever been none of my business. This man put his hands on you. Whatever you decide to do with your career, with your complaints, with your legal options, that's yours. But what I'm doing is mine. Let me do it." She was quiet for a moment. "Don't hurt anyone," she said. "Define hurt," Marco said, and there was something in it that was almost the ghost of a joke. "Marco?" "I'll call you tonight," he said. "Lock the door." The first thing Julian Vane noticed was the email from his CFO at 7:23 in the morning. The subject line was "Urgent, Regulatory Flag," and the body of the email was 3 sentences long, which was 3 sentences more than Preston usually needed to deliver bad news. Julian read it while his driver navigated the morning traffic, and he called Preston immediately. "What kind of regulatory flag?" he asked. "Financial Intelligence Unit," Preston said, and his voice had the particular quality of someone who has been awake since 4 in the morning, managing something they don't fully understand. Someone filed a suspicious activity report on the Cayman vehicle and the Luxembourg structure, both flagged simultaneously, that's not normal. That's not how these things usually happen. Who filed? We don't know yet. The reports are anonymous at this stage. Julian's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. "Get Harmon on it. Tell him I want to know who triggered this by noon." "Preston, Julian, there's more." Preston exhaled. "The Geneva account. Our compliance officer there called 20 minutes ago. Someone from an independent compliance firm showed up at the bank this morning asking to review the account activity. They had proper credentials, they had a letter of instruction from the nominee structure, and the bank is cooperating." Julian felt the first cold edge of something he did not immediately identify as fear, because Julian Vane had not experienced fear in a professional context since 2009 and had almost forgotten what its earliest signal felt like. What he felt instead was the heightened, crystalline alertness of a predator who had just detected something moving in the brush. "That's not possible," he said. "The nominee structure is watertight." "I know. That's why I'm calling you at 7 in the morning. Find Harmon. Get me a full report by 10. He ended the call and sat in the back of the car thinking. The Cayman vehicle and Luxembourg structure flagged simultaneously was the work of someone who already knew where to look and had filed from multiple directions at once. That meant it wasn't a government investigation. Governments were linear. They followed evidence from point to point. This was something else. This was someone who had the map and was pointing to multiple locations on it at the same time. The question was, who had the map? He was still thinking about it when his phone rang again. This time it was his communications director, a woman named Clara, and her voice had none of its usual professional smoothness. "Julian, I need to flag something immediately." "What?" "There's a story moving on the wire, Berlin and New York simultaneously, going live in the next 40 minutes. It's about the Meridian development deal, the tenants, and—" She stopped, which was something Clara didn't. "And there's a sealed settlement from 2016 that's been included in the sourcing documents." The cold edge sharpened into something unmistakable. Julian's hand tightened on the phone. "That settlement is sealed." "I know. Julian, whoever sourced this story had the original documents, not summaries, originals." He was quiet for 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, his mind moved through the architecture of his defensive systems with the speed of a man who has spent years maintaining them. Legal teams, political relationships, media management protocols, financial containment procedures. All of it was designed for threats he could identify, categorize, and route to the appropriate mechanism. What was happening right now did not fit any of the categories. The simultaneous, multi-directional nature of it, regulatory bodies, financial institutions, media outlets, all activated within the same 2-hour window, was not the signature of any threat his systems were designed to handle. It was the signature of someone who had planned this, not as a reaction, as a campaign. "Kill the story," he said. "Julian, it's already on 2 feeds. If we go with the legal threat, it validates the sourcing. If we don't respond, kill it," he said again, and ended the call. His driver was pulling up to the Vane Tower. Julian stepped out, walked through the lobby without acknowledging the doorman who held the door for him, rode the elevator to his floor, and walked straight to his office without stopping at his new secretary's desk. He closed the door, poured nothing from the decanter, it was not yet 8 in the morning, and stood at the window looking at the city. Someone was doing this to him. Someone deliberate, resourced, and fast. Someone who had known about the offshore structure, who had access to a sealed legal document, who had contacts at regulatory bodies in multiple jurisdictions, and who had activated all of it within, he checked his watch, less than 14 hours of a boardroom incident that had involved one person. One person who was gone. One person he had dismissed, whose personal effects were currently in a box at the front desk. Elena Vasquez. He turned the name over in his mind. He pulled up her file on his system. Her emergency contact was listed as Marco Vasquez, her brother. He Googled the name. The search returned nothing unusual in the first 3 results: a social media profile of a man with a private account, a small business registration. He went to the 4th result, then the 5th. He found a brief mention in a 3-year-old article about organized crime in the city, not a named subject, just a peripheral reference, an aside in a paragraph about the restructuring of underground operations following a series of enforcement actions. The name appeared once in passing, with no additional context. Julian stared at the screen. He picked up his phone and called a man named Victor, who was not in his contacts under that name, and who was not someone he told his legal team about. Victor picked up on the first ring. "I need information on a man named Marco Vasquez. Everything you can get, as fast as you can get it. He may be connected to organized crime in this city." There was a pause on Victor's end that Julian did not like. "Marco Vasquez," Victor said slowly. "In this city." "Yes." Another pause. "Julian, are you in a dispute with this man?" "Why?" "Because if you are," Victor said, and his voice had acquired a careful, particular quality that Julian had never heard him before. "If you are," Victor said, "I would strongly suggest you find a way to resolve it." Julian's chest tightened. "Victor, what do you know about him?" "I know that the people in my line of work refer to him by a specific name. They call him the architect, not because he builds things, because when he decides something needs to be dismantled, every piece comes down in the right order, and by the time the last piece falls, there's nothing left to rebuild from." He paused again. "Julian, I've done difficult jobs in this city for 12 years. I don't do jobs that touch Marco Vasquez. Nobody I respect does." Julian said nothing. "Is there anything else?" Victor asked. "No," Julian said. He hung up. He stood at the window for a long time. By noon, the story was on 7 feeds and climbing. Julian's communications team had deployed the standard suppression protocol, legal letters to the outlets, calls to editors, and the activation of 2 media relations that owed Julian favors, and none of it had made any measurable difference. The story was structured in a way that was almost ingenious in its resistance to pressure. The documents had been pre-distributed to enough outlets simultaneously that suppressing 1 or 2 only pushed traffic to the others, and the framing of each piece was legally precise enough that the standard threats of litigation were essentially toothless. Whoever had prepared the sourcing package anticipated the suppression playbook and built around it. By 2 in the afternoon, Julian's stock had dropped 6%. 3 board members had called. 2 of them had asked questions. 1 had issued what amounted to an ultimatum regarding an emergency board meeting. Julian had managed all 3 calls with his characteristic composure, but when he ended the last of them, he sat at his desk for a full minute without moving, which was not something Julian Vane ever did. His phone rang. He didn't recognize the number. He answered it anyway because Julian Vane did not avoid calls. "Mr. Vane," was a voice he didn't recognize, male, low, unhurried in a way that felt deliberate. "My name isn't important. I'm calling on behalf of someone who would like to arrange a meeting." "I don't take unscheduled meetings." "This one," the voice said, "I'd suggest you take. Tonight, your penthouse, 11 o'clock. Julian's grip tightened on the phone. "Who do you work for?" "Someone who has been watching your security cameras for the last 3 weeks. Someone who watched something specific happen on camera yesterday morning. I think you know what I'm referring to." The silence that followed was 4 seconds. 11 o'clock, Julian said, finally. "We'll see ourselves in." And the voice ended the call. You're watching the kind of story that only gets more intense from here. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome. Hit that like button right now and subscribe so the algorithm knows to put more of this content in front of you. And if you want to support what we're building here, you can buy us a cup of coffee using the link in the description. It genuinely helps, and it means we can keep telling stories like this one. Now, back to Julian Vane and the longest night of his life. Julian spent the afternoon making calls. He called his head of physical security, a former Special Forces officer named Blake, and instructed him to have 8 men on the penthouse floor by 10 that night. He called his lawyer, a man named Gould, and gave him a version of events that was partial and careful. He called a city official he had known for 15 years and asked, obliquely, whether the name Marco Vasquez meant anything to the man. The city official's silence lasted long enough to be its own answer, and then the man had said something extraordinary for someone who owed Julian 3 significant favors. He had said, "Julian, I can't help you with this one," and hung up. Each call that failed to yield the reassurance Julian needed added another layer to something that was building in his chest and that he refused, on principle, to name as fear. He had faced regulatory pressure before. He had faced hostile media coverage before. He had faced board revolts and shareholder activism and 2 separate attempts at hostile acquisition. He had handled all of it. This was different only in its speed and coordination, and speed and coordination were manageable if you understood the source and could target your response correctly. But his response mechanisms, the legal team, the media contacts, the political relationships, Victor, were all telling him variations of the same thing. This was not a threat they were equipped to address. And Julian Vane had built his entire sense of personal security on the absolute conviction that he had addressed every possible threat. The discovery that there was a category of threat he had not addressed, that he had left a gap in his defenses large enough for something like this to walk through, was doing something to him that he had not experienced in a very long time. He was on the penthouse level by 9. Blake had the security team in place. 8 men, armed, professional. Blake himself was ex-Delta and had spent 5 years running close protection details for clients in genuinely dangerous parts of the world. Julian had paid serious money for this team, and standing in the penthouse living room with them deployed around the building, he felt the sharp, somewhat shameful recognition that their presence was making him feel better. He was a man who did not believe he needed physical protection. He was discovering that he did. At 10:45, his phone buzzed. A text from Blake. Lobby just reported 6 individuals bypassed security entry. Unknown how. Already on elevator. Julian stared at the text. Bypassed security entry? The lobby had 2 armed guards and a biometric access system that he paid a significant annual fee to maintain. He turned to Blake, who was already reading the same message on his own phone with an expression that Julian had not seen on the man's face before, the expression of someone recalculating. "Get your men to the elevator bank," Julian said. "Already moving," Blake said. He crossed the room and spoke quietly into his earpiece. Then he stopped. "Mr. Vane," his voice was careful, "my men are reporting that the elevator opened on this floor about 40 seconds ago. From inside the building? How? Sir." Blake's hand went to his sidearm. "There are people in the corridor." Julian turned to the main doors of the penthouse. They were closed. He had not heard them open. He stood facing them, and the room was absolutely quiet, and then the door opened. 6 men entered. They were dressed in dark clothing, unremarkable in the way of people who have made a professional decision to be unremarkable. They did not draw weapons. They did not rush the room. They filed in and positioned themselves with a casual, practiced efficiency that was, in its own way, more alarming than aggression would have been. Blake's security team was present. Julian could feel them behind him, hands moving toward holsters, and the 6 men paid them precisely as much attention as you'd pay furniture, which meant they were either insane or they had already done a calculation about the 8-man security team and arrived at a conclusion that gave them no concern. And then the 7th man entered. Julian had formed a mental image of what Marco Vasquez would look like, assembled from the fragments he'd been able to gather, the peripheral crime article, Victor's reference to him, the cold competence of the phone call. He had expected someone visually intimidating, larger, harder, wearing his danger on the outside the way men who traded on physical threat tended to do. Marco Vasquez was none of those things. He was perhaps 40 years old, slim and dressed in a dark suit of such quiet quality that it communicated wealth without advertising it. He had his sister's dark eyes and his sister's stillness, that particular quality of physical restraint that reads not as passivity, but as banked energy. He walked into the room without hurrying, stopped approximately 5 feet from Julian, and looked at him in the manner of a man examining something he has already decided what to do with and is merely confirming his conclusion before proceeding. "Mr. Vane," he said. Julian had decided over the past 2 hours on his approach to this conversation. He had decided to be direct, controlled, and to probe immediately for what this man wanted on the principle that every conflict, regardless of its origin, ultimately resolved into a transaction if you could identify the right terms. This was a sound principle. It had served him well for 22 years. He opened his mouth to speak. Marco spoke first. "My sister," he said, "has been working for you for 3 years. In those 3 years, she has managed your schedule, your communications, your international stakeholder relationships, and your personal arrangements with a level of competence that is, and I say this having her career thoroughly reviewed by people whose judgment I trust, genuinely exceptional. She is one of the most capable people in her field in this city. You used that capability for 3 years, and then you struck her in the face in front of your board of directors because she was 15 minutes late delivering a document." He paused. "I'm going to give you one opportunity to say something useful. I'd suggest you take it carefully." Julian's prepared approach, direct, controlled, transactional, arrived and departed in the space of a single breath, because standing in front of this man, with those 6 unremarkable people positioned around the room, with a comfort that suggested Blake's 8-man armed professionals were not in any meaningful sense a deterrent, Julian felt something he had not felt in over 2 decades drop through the floor of his chest like a stone into dark water. He felt afraid. Not the sharp, adrenaline-bright fear of physical danger, but though that was present, the deeper, systemic fear of a man who had suddenly understood that the architecture he built his entire sense of safety upon has been rendered irrelevant by the specific nature of the threat in front of him. His money didn't matter here. His legal team didn't matter here. His board, his political relationships, his media contacts, none of the things that made Julian Vane powerful in the world he moved in carried any weight in this room tonight. "What do you want?" Julian said. His voice came out level. He was grateful for that. "I want you to understand something first, because understanding is important. You built something, Mr. Vane. You built it carefully, over a long time, and you built it on the assumption that power operates through institutions and money can protect you from any consequence that those institutions might impose. That assumption served you for a long time. It served you because the people you hurt, employees, tenants, business partners, the woman whose settlement is now on every news feed in the Northern Hemisphere, none of them had access to anything outside those institutions. They could complain, they could sue, they could go to the press with stories that your legal team was better equipped to suppress than they were to publicize. You calculated the risk of hurting people and found it acceptable because the only people who could respond were the people you already had the tools to defeat. He took one step closer. "You didn't calculate for me," Marco said. "That's an understandable oversight. Most people don't know to calculate for me. But my sister is not most people, and you made a mistake when you decided that the cost of putting your hands on her was something you could manage." Julian said nothing. There was nothing at this particular moment that he trusted himself to say. "Here is what happens next," Marco said. "Tomorrow morning, your corporate legal team will receive documents requiring the transfer of your majority stake in 3 of your subsidiary companies to a blind trust. The trust will be managed by a board of directors selected by an independent governance firm. The beneficiary of the trust will be Elena Vasquez. The trust will be structured so that its governance is entirely beyond your ability to influence, litigate against, or in any other way affect. He paused. The total value of the transferred assets is approximately $2.3 billion. This is what I've decided is appropriate. You're free to disagree, but I would invite you to consider the cost of disagreeing before you make that decision. Julian's mouth was dry. You can't legally compel. I'm not compelling anything legally, Marco said, and his voice didn't change at all. I'm telling you what you're going to do. There's a difference. The legal mechanism for the transfer has already been drafted by 3 separate firms in 3 separate jurisdictions. It is structured so that it is entirely voluntary on your part, which means your legal team will have nothing to attack. You will sign it because you have understood in the last 10 minutes that the alternative to signing is the continuation of what began this morning. And what began this morning is not finished. The regulatory flags are the beginning, not the end. The media coverage is the beginning. What comes after, and there is a great deal that comes after, is calibrated specifically to dismantle what you've built, piece by piece, in public, over a period of time long enough to be thorough. He let that sit in the air for a moment. Or, he said, you sign the documents, you leave this city within 60 days and do not return, and this ends tonight. Julian stared at him. His mind was still moving, still running calculations, still looking for the angle, the exit, the negotiating position. He was a man who had operated from a position of power for so long that even now, in the middle of the most comprehensively powerless moment of his adult life, the part of his brain that looked for leverage was still running. You said I could say something useful, Julian said finally. What would you accept as useful? Marco looked at him for a moment. An honest account, he said, of exactly how long you've been treating my sister the way you've been treating her. Not a legal answer, not a managed answer, an honest one. Julian Vane, who had not given an honest account of anything in a professional context in at least 15 years, stood in the penthouse he had built with money from schemes that were now public knowledge, surrounded by security professionals who were providing no security, and looked at a man whose stillness was more frightening than rage would have been. And something in him, some part that was still capable of recognizing when a wall had been hit, gave way. 18 months, he said, since she stopped flinching. Marco said nothing. She stopped flinching when I raised my voice about 8 months in, Julian continued, and his voice had acquired a flatness that he didn't entirely recognize as his own. And after that, I escalated, because the flinching was it was how I knew I had. He stopped. He looked at the floor. It was control. I know what it was. The room was very quiet. The documents will be at your legal team's office at 9 tomorrow morning. You have until close of business to sign them. If you don't, your CFO will receive the second package at 5:01 p.m. I would recommend signing them. He turned and walked toward the door. His 6 men moved with him, that same unhurried, practiced efficiency. Blake's security team stood where they were and let them pass. At the door, Marco stopped and turned back one final time. One more thing, he said. If you ever return to this city, and if my sister ever sees your face again, there won't be a second conversation. We'll be done talking. He left. The room was silent. Julian stood where he was for a long time. Blake came to stand beside him, and for once the ex-Delta officer had nothing professional to offer. He stood in silence because there was nothing useful to say. Julian crossed to the window and looked out at the city. It looked exactly the same lights, the same grid, the same skyline he had built his life inside. But something in the way he saw it had changed irrevocably, the way the texture of a room changes when the light source shifts. Same room, same furniture, different light, and suddenly you can see things you couldn't see before and can't unsee again. He picked up his phone and called Gould. "I'm signing the transfer documents in the morning," he said. Gould was quiet for a moment. "Julian, I haven't even seen—" "In the morning," Julian said. "Start reviewing whatever they send at 9. And Gould, don't look for an angle. There isn't one." He ended the call, poured the bourbon he hadn't poured that morning, and sat down in the dark. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and drop a comment below telling us what you thought of this story. We genuinely read every single one. And if you want to support the channel and help us keep producing content at this level, click the link in the description to buy us a cup of coffee. It takes 30 seconds, and it makes a real difference to what we're able to build here. Now, let's bring this home. The documents arrived at Julian's legal team at 9:02 the following morning. They were, as Marco had described, structured with a precision that left no viable legal challenge. 3 separate firms, 3 separate jurisdictions, a transfer mechanism that was entirely voluntary in form and utterly compelled in substance. Gould called Julian at 9:30 and spent 20 minutes looking for what he had been told not to look for, and then called back at 10 to report that there was, in fact, no angle. Julian signed the documents at 11:14 a.m. He did it sitting alone at his desk, with his hands steady and his face composed, because Julian Vane had never once in his life allowed himself to fall apart where anyone could see it, and this was not the day he was going to start. The transfer was processed and confirmed by 3 p.m. $2.3 billion in assets, held in a trust that bore his name only in the paperwork that had already been shredded, with Elena Vasquez as sole beneficiary and a governance structure so airtight that Julian's best lawyer had spent 4 hours staring at it and then quietly put the folder down. By 5 p.m., Julian Vane had booked a flight. Not a commercial flight, he was not yet reduced to those indignities, but a private charter, destination a property he owned in the south of France that was not among the assets that had been transferred because Marco, with the particular precision of a man who makes points rather than examples, had taken exactly what he said he would take and nothing more. Julian stood in the lobby of the Vane Tower one final time. He did not say goodbye to anyone. He walked through the lobby that had his name above the door, past the doorman who had held the door for him every morning for 11 years, and he got into the car that would take him to the airfield. He did not look back. Elena found out about the trust on a Thursday afternoon, sitting in her kitchen with a mug of tea and a laptop open to a job search she had been conducting with the quiet, methodical focus of a woman who had decided that her next position was going to be chosen by her rather than fallen into. She had not been following the news about Julian. She had made a deliberate decision not to, because watching his unraveling would have taken energy she preferred to spend on things that were hers, not things that were about him. The call came from a law firm she didn't recognize. A woman named Harris introduced herself as the managing partner of the firm administering a newly established trust, and she explained in the clear, precise language of a legal professional who had been briefed to say nothing she didn't need to say, that Elena Vasquez was the named beneficiary of a trust holding assets valued at approximately $2.3 billion, that the trust was governed by an independent board, and that Elena's access to the trust's resources was unconditional and effective immediately. Elena sat very still through the entirety of this explanation. When Harris finished, there was a silence of perhaps 10 seconds. "My brother," Elena said. "I'm not at liberty to discuss the trust establishment," Harris said. "Right," Elena said. "Right." She thanked Harris, confirmed her contact information, and ended the call. She set her phone down on the kitchen table and looked at the wall for a long time. Then she called Marco. He picked up on the second ring. "You need to explain this to me," she said. "It's a trust," he said, "in your name." "Marco, it's $2 billion. 2.3, he said. Marco, that's his money. That's Julian's money." "It was Julian's money. Now it's yours. The mechanism is entirely legal. The transfer was voluntary." "How voluntary?" A brief pause. "He had options," Marco said. "He made a choice." Elena pressed her fingers to her eyes. "Did you hurt anyone?" "No." he said. And she believed him because she knew the difference between the ways her brother said things, and this was the way he said things that were straightforwardly true. She exhaled. I don't know what to do with $2.3 billion, she said. You'll figure it out, Marco said. You've always figured things out. She laughed once, unexpectedly. It was a small sound, not the laugh of someone who found everything resolved and perfect, but the laugh of someone who has been sitting with something hard for a long time and has just had the first moment of genuine release. You could have just, I don't know, you could have just let me handle it. You were handling it, Marco said. I handled my part. Your part? He put his hands on you, Marco said, and his voice had that quality again, that particular flatness that was not coldness, but the absence of any performance. Pure statement of fact. Nobody gets to do that and keep what they built. That's not the world I'll allow. Yelena was quiet for a moment. Outside her kitchen window, the city was doing what cities do. Movement, noise, the continuous mechanical churn of a place that doesn't stop. She had been a part of that machine for 3 years in a building that had her employer's name above the door, in a role that had quietly sandpapered her sense of self down to something smaller than she started with. She was not smaller now. She was, sitting at her kitchen table with the phone in her hands and $2.3 billion in a trust in her name, precisely herself. And it was the first time in a long time that she could say that with confidence. Thank you, she said. You're my sister, Marco said, which was in his particular language the complete answer. Come to dinner on Sunday, she said. I'll bring wine, he said. She smiled. Good night, Marco. Good night, Yelena. What nobody in the financial press ever managed to piece together fully, though several came close, was the precision with which the entire operation had been sequenced. The regulatory flags went in first because Marco understood that regulatory investigations, once opened, could not be quietly closed by the subject of the investigation. They were the anchor. Whatever Julian's legal team managed to suppress or delay in the media space, the regulatory flags would remain open, generating ongoing institutional pressure that required resources to manage and left a permanent bruise on the public record. The Geneva compliance visit had gone in simultaneously for a different reason. It signaled to Julian's banking relationships that the offshore architecture was compromised, which meant that any attempt to move money defensively, which Julian would have attempted the moment he understood the nature of the threat, would be flagged as suspicious activity in real time, making the situation materially worse. The media releases had been sequenced for maximum resonance. The Meridian development story, the tenants, the coordinated displacement, the silent interest in the consortium that bought the land, was the most publicly legible part of Julian's wrongdoing. It translated immediately to public anger in a way that insider trading charges, which required financial sophistication to fully appreciate, did not. So the development story went first, at noon, when it would catch the afternoon news cycle and carry through the evening broadcasts. The sealed settlement followed 4 hours later, after the development story had established the character frame. By the time the settlement details were public, readers already had a context, not a man who had made business mistakes, but a man who used money and legal mechanisms to hurt people and escape consequences, and the settlement fit seamlessly into that frame. Marco had not learned the sequencing from any formal study. He had learned it the way he had learned everything, from 2 decades of operating in spaces where the ability to plan ahead, not one move, not two, but the full sequence through to the conclusion, was the difference between survival and its alternative. He had made mistakes early in his career, moved too fast or in the wrong order, and had spent years building a method out of the corrections those mistakes demanded. By the time Julian Vane slapped Elena in that boardroom, Marco's method was so developed and so precise that executing it against a man like Julian was, in the most honest accounting, not particularly difficult. Julian was protected against the institutions that governed the legitimate world. He was not protected against someone who had spent 20 years learning to operate in the space between those institutions. The property in France received Julian quietly, the way expensive places receive people with money and nowhere else to go, with indifference and at significant daily cost. He was not broken in any conventional sense. He was not in prison, was not destitute, still had resources that most people would consider extraordinary. What he had lost was specific: the city, the building with his name above the door, the board, the relationships, the daily architecture of a life built on the proposition that he was untouchable. These were, in the accounting he had always made of his life, everything. Without them, the man who remained was someone he wasn't entirely sure how to be. He did not reach out to Elena. He did not contact Marco. He understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has just received a comprehensive lesson in consequences, that the instruction he had been given, "Don't return, don't let her see your face," was not a threat made for effect. It was a statement of terms, and the terms were final. He hired a therapist, which surprised even him. He spent 6 months in France doing something he had not done since his early 20s, thinking, slowly, without the pressure of an agenda, about who he was and how he had become that person. The therapist was expensive and Zurich-trained and had a particular patience with high-functioning men who had arrived at her couch through collision with consequences rather than through any personal desire to grow. She did not tell Julian what to think. She asked questions and then sat in silence while he answered them, and the answers, slowly, began to cohere into something he could hold and examine. Whether any of this constituted redemption is a question that belongs to Julian Vane alone. It is not a question that concerned Marco Vasquez in the slightest, because Marco's interest in Julian ended the moment the documents were signed. The man could spend the rest of his life in the south of France becoming a saint or deteriorating into something worse. Marco's calculation was complete regardless of what Julian did with the time he had remaining. The point had been made, the cost had been extracted, the lesson had been administered with sufficient thoroughness that Marco was confident it would not need repeating. Rossi asked him once, a week after Julian's departure, what he had said to the man in the penthouse. Marco had been sitting at his desk reviewing something unrelated, and he looked up from the document and thought about the question for a moment. "I told him the truth," Marco said. "Which truth?" Rossi asked. "That he miscalculated," Marco said. "That's all it ever comes down to. People like him miscalculate because they believe that their power is total, and the only way to correct that belief, the only way that actually sticks, is to show them, concretely, that it isn't." Rossi nodded. "And the sister, Elena?" Marco looked back at his document. "She's fine," he said, and the way he said it, that same flat certainty with which he said everything that was simply true, contained for anyone who knew him well enough to read it, the complete weight of 20 years of a particular kind of love. The love of someone who had grown up alongside another person through everything that shapes a life, and who had made a decision, somewhere in that growing up, that whatever the world chose to throw at her, he would be the thing the world ran into first. Carver, who had been in the room that first day, asked Marco a different question in the week after everything concluded. He had asked, was it worth it? The exposure, the resources, the attention it drew? Marco considered this for exactly as long as it took him to pour 2 glasses of scotch and hand one to Carver. Then he said, "She's my sister." Carver nodded and drank his scotch. That was the complete answer. It had always been the complete answer. 3 months later, the trust made its first public announcement, a $50 million initiative to provide legal and financial support to workers in wrongful termination cases involving documented workplace abuse. The governance board of the trust, in its first formal communication to the press, noted that the initiative was named after no one, it bore no donor's name, carried no individual's branding, and sought no recognition for its benefactor beyond the simple statement that it existed because someone believed it should. The press ran a range of stories about the initiative. Several of them attempted to trace it back to the Vane global transfer and the quiet exodus of Julian Vane from the city, and all of them hit the same wall of legal precision that had characterized every aspect of what happened from the beginning. The story existed. Its origins were clean. Its operation was transparent. The money was real. Beyond that, there was nothing to find, because the person who put it in motion had never done anything in his life that he intended to be found. Julian Vane issued one statement from his property in France through his communications team about his departure from the company. It referenced a desire to pursue personal interests and a planned transition of corporate leadership. It did not mention Elena Vasquez. It did not reference the news cycle that had surrounded his departure. It was a statement of a man who had decided that the wisest remaining course was the complete absence of noise. He did not return to the city. On a Sunday evening in early December, Elena answered the door to find her brother standing on the step with a bottle of wine in one hand and his coat open against the cold, looking exactly as he always looked, composed, unhurried, entirely himself. She stepped back to let him in, and he crossed the threshold into the warm-lit kitchen where dinner was almost ready, and she took the wine from him and he sat at the kitchen table the way he had sat at her kitchen table 100 times before, in a dozen different kitchens in the cities and apartments they had moved through across the decades of their lives. "How's everything?" she asked, uncorking the wine. "Quiet," he said. "Good quiet or watching quiet?" He looked at her with something that was as close to a smile as Marco Vasquez generally allowed himself in public. "Good quiet," he said. She poured the wine and put a glass in front of him, and they sat across the table from each other in the way of people who don't need to fill silence with anything because they have known each other long enough that silence is its own complete communication. "I got a call from the trust board today," Elena said. "They want to expand the initiative, employment law, housing rights. They think there's capacity for it." "There is," Marco said. "I want to be involved," she said. "Not just as a name on a document, actually involved." He looked at her. "Good," he said. "You think I can do it?" "I've always thought you could do anything," he said. Which was, from Marco Vasquez, the highest possible statement of faith in another human being, because he was not a man who said things he didn't mean. Elena picked up her glass. Marco picked up his, and in the quiet of that kitchen, with the city moving outside the window and dinner on the stove, and the wine open between them, they sat together the way siblings sit who have been through something real and have come out the other side of it still whole, and still each other's, which is not the ending of a story, but the beginning of the only kind of story worth telling, the kind where someone was hurt and someone who loved them refused to accept that as the final word, and the world, stubbornly and at significant cost to the arrogant, bent. That is what family means. Not proximity, not obligation, not the accident of shared blood. Family means that when someone puts their hands on yours and expects no consequence, they discover, too late, always too late, that they miscounted. They thought they were dealing with one person, they were dealing with two, and one of them had been watching the whole time. That's the end of this story, and if you made it all the way here, you are exactly the kind of person this channel is made for. Drop a comment below and tell us, what was the moment that hit hardest for you? Was it the boardroom, the penthouse confrontation, or that final dinner between Elena and Marco? We genuinely want to know. Make sure you're subscribed. Stories like this come out regularly, and you don't want to miss what's next. And one last thing, if you want to support the channel and show some love for the work that goes into crafting content at this level, the link in the description lets you buy us a cup of coffee. It's a small thing that makes a massive difference, and we are genuinely grateful for every single one. Until the next story, take care of your people, and don't let anyone make you feel like you're on your own.